Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please visit avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphiné, and today I am joined by our returning guest, Dr. Julia Sadusky. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
That's great. And Dr. Sadusky was a graduate of Ave Maria as an undergraduate over 10 years ago, and worked in the field and did a master's and then eventually a doctorate in psychology at Regent. She's an author, speaker, licensed psychologist. She owns Luke's Counseling and Consulting in Littleton, Colorado, where she operates a private practice as well. She's written some books with Ave Maria Press called Talking with Your Teen About Sex, a practical guide for Catholics, and Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex. She's also co-authored a book called Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experience of Today's Youth. So just thank you so much for all of your work. We have another podcast diving into the issues of sexuality and gender and just human sexuality and helping children and helping ourselves heal and understand. And it was so beautiful to get to have you kind of just unpack all of that and really lead us and walk us through that. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's great to be able to share a little bit about it.
Yeah. So today we have a different topic. I want to talk about the whole relationship between our Catholic faith and psychology. That, in many ways, I think some people really find these going together. There are lots of Christians who enter the counseling field because they want to be of service. My wife is a licensed mental health counselor, an MLHC, and also addiction specialist, and works in the field and has worked now in the field for 20 years. And I think often a lot of our students, again, have this great desire. So the field is often filled with people that enter the field with this Christian desire to serve and to help and accompany people. But at the same time, there are aspects of psychology, whether or not in its roots in Freud, or some of its modern roots. I think you could say its roots really go back to the ancients, but where there was sometimes an anti-religious or really anti-humanistic understanding. Sometimes there were some just ways in which I think psychologists at different times in the 20th century began to see religion as a source of guilt. One of the things I've learned as the field has shifted over the last 50 years, I've learned more that religion now is often seen as kind of a part of somebody's capital. If they have a religious faith, they're more likely to recover from whatever they're struggling with. So there's more of a tendency among, say, counseling and other things to kind of just take whatever people have in terms of their familial or religious backgrounds and build those up. So what would you say to somebody who thinks, though, that there's a fundamental opposition between Christianity and psychology? How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I do think that the philosophical assumptions that are in almost every developed theory that we use in the field of psychology, so think cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, narrative therapy, psychoanalytic theory, all of these therapies were developed by people who were not Christians and who did not subscribe to a Christian worldview. So we have behaviorists, right? We have all these different forms of understanding the human person and human behavior not rooted in a Christian worldview. So I have to concede that that is the case. I guess the question becomes, is there a way to utilize scientific theories and things that are true about the human person, that our thoughts impact our behaviors and impact our feelings and our physical sensations, and that regulating our physical sensations can help change our thoughts and change our behaviors and help allow us to interpret things differently in our life? Can we utilize these theories for what is true within them and not lose anything that is good and true about the human person and about God and about what it is to flourish? And I've found as a psychologist, and without knowing ahead of time, right, if that was possible, that it has been not just possible, but really critical to the work of therapy being effective, is being able to pool all the good and the true within theories of psychology and to integrate spiritual principles that are a reliable guide for us in walking with people.
It reminds me a little bit of how Aquinas saw in Aristotle an authentic interpreter of human nature. Not that Aristotle saw the whole human person. Aristotle certainly didn't see our calling to become children of God or friends of God. He didn't see our capacity for resurrection. Right? He didn't really understand our being created and loved into being by God. And yet he also was able to articulate certain principles of biological nature, of moral nature, of the human person in our individual, familial, and political context that were really helpful. He didn't understand God as creator, but he did kind of understand God as first cause. That helped us to think properly about God's unique existence as the cause of all causes, for human nature and virtue as having habits. We're not merely minds, like we're not merely angels that simply decide things. Instead, we live in an embodied way. So our minds and our hearts go together, our logos and our thumos, as Aristotle would say. And so, right, Aquinas took a lot of that from Aristotle to explain and go deeper into, in a way, the gospel. And I don't think it's the same thing, but I think there are parts of there that our faith and reason are not in contradiction because God created the whole thing. All right. So, all right, God's the source of everything that he created and the source of his revelation. So people like Aristotle or other ancient philosophers, or even perhaps other ancient, religious figures who saw true things about the world, those things are still true, even if they might be corrected and adjusted by the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. And it seems to me in a lot of ways that contemporary psychological, some of the things you were talking about, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, those are attempts at trying to understand the human person. They're attempts at trying to understand human nature, where it goes wrong, and when it goes wrong, how we can try to redirect it. And those things, just like, medicine that looks at the vision of the body, they may not understand the fullness of the body, but they can also understand what a broken arm is and how to fix it. In the same way, sometimes, when you are when you're ruminating and obsessing and worrying, right? Sometimes you may have read in Matthew 6, Jesus saying, do not be anxious about tomorrow. Do not worry. And you believe that, right? And you're convinced when he says that who of you can add, right, an inch to your height or a day to your life? If you can't do this, then why do you worry about tomorrow? Today has enough troubles. So, and they go, yeah. And then they just go back to worrying and ruminating. And sometimes practices from cognitive behavioral therapy or from things can also elicit true aspects of us, because we have minds that are immaterial, but we also have emotions. And then we have, right, appetites. And it's the integration of all three of those that are necessary. So do you find that kind of a helpful image?
Yes. I mean, I think being able to pull for and draw from psychology what is good, and being able to acknowledge the generosity of God, that God does not just say only Christians can know facets, right, of the human person and of life. I mean, there are unique, distinct contributions that, are a gift to the church within all fields of study, including the sciences, including psychology. And so, yes, being able to draw from and draw out those pieces, not discount them on principle, but also critically engage and evaluate them. I mean, I remember at Ave Maria studying under Keith Hood and taking the foundations class where we read about the people who developed all these theories. And it was so fascinating to learn the life stories of the people who are really the figures of psychology as we understand it today, and just how limited they were, right? And yet they had something distinct and unique to offer that is really helpful. And yes, we can read scripture and we can reflect on all kinds of wonderful disciplines to help us, including psychology, but not exclusively it.
Now, there's a chapter in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. I think it's book 4 called Morality and Psychoanalysis. He's writing on morality, Christian morality. And so he wants to say, what about morality and psychoanalysis? And does psychoanalysis replace morality, or does morality replace psychoanalysis? In a way, are they in competition with one another? And he makes a distinction there. He says, in some ways, like if we listen to Freud and his understanding of philosophy or God, he's not really a philosopher and he doesn't know that much about God. But if we listen to him about how to help neurotics or people who struggle with bad neuroses, at times he may have clinical skills that are helpful, as do others, other figures. And one of the things he says there, though, that I always thought was really helpful is he talks about kind of ultimately at the heart of each person is this free, is really our center of responsibility, our center of volition, willing, knowing, loving. That's really kind of who we are. And that, in a way, is really our moral selves, that we either learn to love God with all our heart, mind, and strength, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, or we turn away from that order, that good order, and we turn into some way of manipulating God, ourselves, and others to somehow please our egos. Now, that's really the element of the moral life. But what Lewis says there, he says, but what about somebody whose emotions are so overwhelming, right? Somebody who is filled with phobia. I think phobias are a great example where the thought of going out in public is so overwhelming they can't do it. The thought of, the fear of heights are so great. I had a friend who was a priest who struggled immensely with a fear of small places and couldn't go in elevators. He's a holy man, but he couldn't go in elevators. Like, well, what's going on there? But there's ways that, and I don't like spiders. So you could tell me that tarantulas are fun and cuddly, but I ain't sticking my hand, or I'm going to be petrified to stick my hand in a jar of tarantulas. And I don't know if I could do it. I don't know. So this idea in a way then, and so he says in a way, well, when somebody is so overwhelmed by phobias, and maybe you could also think about fears, resentments, or depression, whatever, when you're so overwhelmed, the emotions are so overwhelming that the moral self really can't even engage. And so that's kind of what he says. It's like your volitional self is so overridden by these extreme emotions, either angers or fears, or possibly even the opposite of the complete shutting down of all emotions and depression. And so I've always loved that. I think there was a time when you were in the class, and I think I taught that. And so I was wondering, does that still ring true to you? And how would you maybe, recommunicate that in your own words, or perhaps improve upon it based upon your own experience as a licensed and practicing psychologist?
Yeah. I mean, it just gets at the heart of how I think of psychology intersecting with spirituality and faith and Christianity. Of course, I want for all the people I meet with to know God, to love God, to serve God, and be happy with him in the next life, right? I want that for myself. I want that for every soul in my world. And I see so often how mental health concerns or just the consequences of the fall, limited people who hurt us in our lives and experiences that are not God's best for us, things God never wanted us to have to endure before the fall. All these things obstruct our view of ourselves and obstruct our view of others and confound our ability to encounter God in who he actually is. And so there are ways in psychology to remove barriers. And we do that by becoming aware of them, identifying them, using language to communicate them to ourselves and to others, and building new relationships with ourselves and others in this practice environment of therapy, right? And it's towards another end. It's not, I love when my clients are less depressed when they leave. I love, I expect them to be not having panic attacks. And I expect them to even be able to take risks and do things that terrify them when it's needed in life. I want more than that for them. And experiencing the more than that comes through a certain level of mental wellness, and therapy can help remove the barriers that obstruct our ability to know ourselves and know God and know others more fully and be who we're called to be.
That's really beautifully put. I love that image of that, right? We want more than kind of psychological wholeness, but in a way, not less than, right? So the integrity of the human person is also a good, right? So, right, even, and I think that's sometimes that I think students that are interested in psychology also sometimes worry about kind of what are they going to say about the big questions and the big issues, and sometimes just helping the person stay alive for another day is really good, and that's a good thing. So, maybe especially, obviously, I think, a lot of listeners may not have, gotten to know you. They may not have heard of you yet. I suspect over time that, that people will continue to turn to you and, for really being looking for help, especially in so many areas relating to sexuality and gender and so many issues that people are struggling with today. But could you just give a little bit of your background? What's your story? How did you end up studying psychology? I know you played tennis in college, and you, now are, a licensed psychologist and run a private practice and give talks and, tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, grew up on the East Coast in Delaware, which if you've never been is because it's very small and it's usually a pass-through state. But I grew up there, one of 7 kids, second oldest. And, I was formed by parents who were pretty committed Catholics as far as, brought us to daily mass and brought us to mass on Sunday. And I watched them go on retreats, and we went on family retreats. So there was a really embodied faith in my home. And also there was a social justice component to it for my parents. So they did prison ministry. And so I had the opportunity to encounter a lot of people who were different from me and who had not been afforded the family and the opportunities that I had been given. And I remember my dad teaching me at a young age when we would go places to introduce myself to these, former inmates, if there was a kind of benefit event. And I would say to him, well, they make me uncomfortable and I don't understand, I don't know how to talk to them. And he said, you can talk to anybody. You can talk to anybody. And you can learn how to be comfortable with people who are different. And I think that was actually a really formative piece for me of my work in becoming a psychologist. It grew in me a curiosity about people. I became aware that there were people who had not had the life and the framework that I'd been given. And then I had people in my own life, friends and family members who suffered from mental illness. And I knew that it was not their fault. I knew them, and I knew they did not choose the things they were navigating. And I remember as young as 12, not knowing how to help and wanting to help. And I saw at that time clinicians come and go from people's lives who I knew and not show up in the ways I thought they needed. And I think as a teenager, even, I felt compelled to want to learn about the human person, to be able to be that person in the room and be effective in ways that the people I knew and loved had not experienced. And so it really fueled in me a desire to become a psychologist, and thank God for that. So that was kind of a little bit of my journey. And then, of course, I went to Ave Maria when they didn't even have a psych department my freshman year. And so I was part of the students interviewing Keith Hood at that time, and who was then the department head. And anyway, so that was kind of my journey to getting more into psychology, just really curious about people and wanting to figure out what helps us grow and flourish.
That's beautiful. And then how did you move from that to deciding to develop a private practice, to writing books, to giving talks?
Honestly, none of that was at all what I expected. I was never a person, even getting my doctorate, who wanted a private practice. I'm not business-minded, so that was not on my radar. I remember them asking when we went to grad school, do you want to teach? Do you want to train people, write books? And I said, I don't want to do any of that. Just put me in an office with people and I'll be happy. And in some ways, that's still true. I mean, if tomorrow everything else went away, I would be totally content to be a therapist. That really is where my heart is. But as I got older and I did more research in this area, I started to see how much of an impact there can be in the more popular sector, being able to bring ideas that are quite complicated to more people. And a lot of us can't afford to go to weekly therapy. And so trying to bridge the gap was really important. And then ultimately, why private practice? I had a actual ethical dilemma come up in a place I was working where it wasn't going to be sustainable for me to be in that environment anymore. And so I, on a kind of sudden impulse, said, I've got to get out of here and I've got to do my own thing. And thanks be to God for that, because I don't think I would have done it otherwise. And God has really used the opportunity to have my own practice to give me the flexibility to do things like this podcast and writing and speaking a little bit more.
Wow, it's courageous there's a kind of courage just entering into the suffering of others. I think every therapist has an element of courage where you see pain and you run to it. And then the courage of trying to figure out how to live your Christian faith, your Catholic faith authentically, also amidst some practices, or I mean here just kind of the philosophical principles of certain psychological schools, and often sometimes the ways that they are lived out in departments that can be sometimes in conflict with Christian principles, and then again also even in the field. And so, wow, it takes a lot of courage to step out. Takes a lot of courage to step out there. And I think that's a beautiful way to model for your clients, ultimately, the willingness to do hard things, the ability to challenge yourself to do those things that might be overwhelming. And I think it's a beautiful model to consider. I was always reminded of, there's a passage in 2 Timothy 1:7. For you did not receive a spirit, and this is really the Holy Spirit, you did not receive a spirit of timidity or cowardice, but a spirit of power, love, and self-control. Right? And I think we really have this, but it's got to be transformative over time. And so it's great to see that not only your intelligence and your understanding of the human person, but also your willingness to accompany people in suffering, but also to navigate life. That's really beautiful. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about a few things. One, I want to talk a little bit about this mental health epidemic that's going on in our country. The Surgeon General called it an epidemic of loneliness. The youth mental health is really struggling. I'd love to talk a little bit about that, and maybe people who might be struggling who are listening to this, and also some maybe some tips, right? We can't do a counseling session, but we might be able to look at a few ideas. And I'd also love to talk a little bit about maybe it's just some insights from C.S. Lewis and why C.S. Lewis kind of helps us to understand kind of the human person, and both in his moral dimension and spiritual dimension, but also in a way, even in a psychological dimension. And love to hear some of your thoughts on that as well. So thank you. We'll be back in a couple minutes.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
We've been talking today about the larger picture of Christianity and psychology. How do they go together? How are they different? Occasionally, how do they even, bump up against one another? All right. But I also thought we are in an age, too, though, where there are a lot of problems. And so I think, how can Christianity and counseling work together to help people heal, both non-Christians and Christians alike? So I thought I'd just summarize a couple points here from again, one was the 2023. This is the Surgeon General's report, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. He describes here for 2003 to 2020, basically just before the pandemic, but this is what's described. So companionship decreased by 14 hours per month, basically shared leisure per month. Social engagement with friends went down from 60 hours per month 20 years ago to 20 hours per month. The non-household family social engagement went from 35 hours a month to 22 hours per month. Social engagement with others went from 54 hours per month to 34 hours per month. Basically, people are isolating more and more. They're interacting with family less, with friends less, in social groups less. It mentions here that lacking social connection has the highest mortality comparison, more so than smoking 15 cigarettes daily, more than drinking 6 alcoholic drinks daily, more than obesity. Right? It's actually 5 times worse than obesity. Right? But I just mentioned that because people are often talking about obesity, air pollution, smoking. Right. And here's the Surgeon General of the U.S. Right. There's also then there was a study by the CDC on mental health among youth risk behavior survey from 2011 to 2021. Over those 10 years, the percentage of high school students who experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased from 28% to 42%. Right? Almost 1 out of 3 to now 2 out of 5. Seriously considered attempting suicide, 16% to 22%, 1 out of 5. Made a suicide plan, 13% to 18%. There's another description here in that same element where they looked at persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Overall, 42%. Among young women, 57% have persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Among young men, 30%. And of course, don't think that the women are doing that much better than the men, because in the suicide statistics, young men, just men are, I think, 3 times more likely to complete a suicide attempt and to end their lives by suicide. So, we're in an age of isolation an age of persistent feelings of hopelessness and sadness, increased anxiety. I think also within this, increased anger. Right? So just, you're in the midst of this as a counselor, as a therapist, a psychologist. Also, you work in youth ministry. Right? What's your understanding of the situation we're in? And maybe what are some beginning resources that we could maybe start with ourselves and maybe start with those we know to try to help, right? Not react to the situation, but respond intelligently, emotionally, but also courageously.
Yeah, great question. Yes, it is a really challenging time to be a young person in America. It is a challenging time to be alive, which I don't think is exceptional to our period of time, but there are obviously unique challenges people are facing. As a clinician, I see it really dramatically in the last few years that the intensity has gotten worse of people's suffering. The isolation has certainly gotten worse. I mean, I did my dissertation on loneliness and coping in single sexual minorities. So as you're saying all those statistics, I'm just remembering that loneliness, yes, when it's toxic, is life-threatening for people. And it has that quality to it. The depth of when you feel lonely, when I feel lonely, it is just gut-wrenching, right? And so these coping skills that people are drawn to, even things like making a suicide plan or having suicidal thoughts, we don't always think of those as coping skills, but they're ways people are trying to figure out a way out because they feel trapped, they feel stuck. And I think one of the challenges today that I see, especially with young people, is we do have a lot of education on mental health. We know the symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so you can tell somebody you're depressed without telling them anything that connects you to them, right? You can tell somebody you had a panic attack and them know you less than they did before. Oh, me too. I had a panic attack too, right? It's just so normalized. And I often remind my clients that, okay, it's one thing to tell somebody you feel a lot of shame. It's another thing to say, my mind's telling me the story that I am defective and terrible and disgusting. Suddenly you're going deeper. Suddenly that person can respond and validate and say, instead of saying, well, you're not disgusting, which we sometimes say just to make ourselves feel better, but to say, wow, I felt that too in life, right? I've had moments where I felt like I don't like the person I see in the mirror. And in our communities, I think the thing I hear time and time again is people don't need anybody to fix it. People don't even need a solution to their problem. They just need somebody to stay in the room and receive them where they are. And I think many people go to therapy because they feel unworthy of that, and they can kind of get around feeling unworthy of that opportunity by paying somebody for it. But there is, and there's more to that, more than that to therapy. But I think being able to acknowledge that where we can start is validating with people the details of the emotional life and communicate. I actually want to know what's going on the inside. Somebody said to me just yesterday, they said, it's so refreshing to have somebody who I can tell wants to know what's happening on the inside. He said, a lot of people say they want to know me, they want to understand me. But as soon as I start sharing, you can tell they don't want to know that. And in the place that we're in, where things do feel bleak and young people feel increasingly angry and self-loathing and miserable, what we're going to receive when we receive people is a lot of stuff that are hard to hear. And being able to stay where your feet are and receive a person and not go to quick solutions, but hold the belief that existing is a good, and that a person being in the world is a gift. And even if they don't see it yet, they have every possibility of learning what that gift is. They can't do that if they don't stay.
I've heard it said that we are not human doings, but human beings. And we have to be willing to rest in our own existence and in the existence of another person, no matter how distressing it is, or no matter how distressing their situation might be, before we try to do things with them. Or would that be a way of putting it?
That's right. Yes, I often even say I'm not exempt to wanting to fix people's problems. I mentioned earlier why I did this was to help people, right? But I catch myself as a therapist. Sometimes I'll just say out loud to my client, you know what, I want to give you a solution right now. And I have an idea even. But I know you don't just need me to tell you what to do in this moment. And being able to model that being that you describe is a pathway for freedom. It's harder than ever to sit with ourselves.
Yeah. So how would you suggest then, maybe people that are struggling or, and I think that sometimes you have this, maybe, 40% of might be really struggling with things that could be perhaps actually general anxiety disorder or clinical depression. But it seems to me the next 40% probably experience a larger degree of anxiety and depression or resentment than is really healthy. So what can those people do? I definitely think validating is very important, and finding maybe a safe place to express one's, a secret shared to the right person, or a problem shared can be a problem half solved. But what are ways that people can kind of reduce maybe these aspects? What are something maybe, I think it's dialectical behavioral therapy that speaks about acceptance and change. So we do want to accept things, accept our feelings without maybe judging them, be aware of our experience, and also begin to, find a path, find meaning, discover meaning and purpose, in different ways. So what would you say about that aspect?
Yes, it's so important. As humans, we're wired. It's important to acknowledge that we're wired for homeostasis. We're wired for balance. And so we can get adjusted to just about anything. So you mentioned the 40% who are suffering with, diagnosable disorders, and the 40% who are maybe you could say clinically miserable, right? Not doing well, but not not dying either, right? And maybe don't want to die, but are really not doing well. And we can adapt to that environment and think that's just kind of what life is going to be. And what do I have to complain about? And you mentioned validation, and that is a critical piece. And I always tell my clients, you can't validate just to move on to the next thing. Like, okay, I'll validate. It's fine. Really leaning into that moves us towards change. It's like self-compassion. These principles aren't just nice thoughts. They are scientifically proven to help us move towards the life we want. So being able to validate the situation as it is actually gives you clarity, and it activates a part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, that allows you to plan, judge, interpret future events accurately, and have clarity about what is to come. And so as soon as you start to engage your mind and just ask yourself, what am I noticing? Oh, I'm noticing I'm bored, or I'm noticing I'm anxious, or I'm noticing I'm sad or angry. You start to engage a whole nother process where you're actually more regulated just by naming, I'm noticing this. I'm having the thought that. I'm noticing a feeling of. And anytime you can externalize those things is going to help you, right? So that's where you start to move towards regulation more and more, being able to externalize through writing or through drawing or through listening to music that conveys that emotion, right? To validate it or to journal about it. To be able to talk to a friend, obviously. All of these things, talk to a priest, are helpful steps. And then being aware of the moments where we want to hold on to the pain. We all have that, where somebody's ready to help and I'm not quite ready yet to be out of this emotional space. And I think it's important to be honest about that. But there are times in life where we're resistant to change, and that's normal. That's not uncommon. And it's better to be honest about that and patient with ourselves than to, act like we're ready and then go to people seeking support and then deflect the support right and left. So being able to be honest about where you are in your process. And I guess the last thing I would say is we can ask ourselves, what am I needing right now? And we don't tend to do that often, where we turn towards ourselves and say, hey, what am I needing? What am I noticing? What could help? But being in a role where we're stepping in and taking responsibility for our life by checking in and saying, what can help? Sometimes we don't get an answer inside. It's like, it's all quiet. Or sometimes you get anger. Like, why do I have to be the one to do it for myself? But I think asking better questions of ourselves that move us towards health is a really good place to start.
Yeah. I do want to turn to a couple questions about C.S. Lewis and his view of the human person. But I have to ask one question first, in part just because it's something that's been on my own heart and in my own life. But when you read all these studies about, that this generation of young people is at least reports being, more hopeless and depressed than really any other generation. That also means, in a way, if 10 to 30-year-olds are struggling more than ever, that means you have a generation of parents from 35 to 60 that, in a way, are struggling more as parents than ever before because their children are struggling more than ever before. And I feel like we don't really talk a lot about that. And, I'm a parent and a grandparent now. And, and I think a lot of parents see their loved ones struggling, and it becomes, it becomes so difficult. So what would you say to, and it could be, just people who love people who are struggling with these, with these characteristics, either maybe siblings or parents?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's well understood, right, that the best way to torture somebody is to show them somebody they love suffering or threaten it. And so many parents and grandparents, I meet with parents and grandparents who are desperately trying to understand how to show up for somebody else, and they themselves are crushed by the weight of the responsibility and the powerlessness of not being able to take away the pain of somebody you would die for, right? And that's the reality of the intensity of the suffering generationally that you're talking about. And I think, again, it's the same thing I just said, which is, do you notice, right, the toll it's taking? I mean, so many of us, we focus on others because it's so much easier than connecting to ourselves. But if I'm giving from an empty cup, I'm giving from an empty cup, and I'm not giving what I could be. And so I can't tell you the amount of times that parents bring teens to me, and then a few months in, their teen's getting some help, and they say, hey, can I meet with you? Because I've been having panic attacks because I'm watching my teenager suffer with suicidality. And just to really normalize that in a generation where mental health was, and it still is to a large extent, taboo, to move away from the blame game. Because parents love their kids, they will blame themselves. What could I have done differently? And anytime you are looking in the rearview mirror, you are not present to your loved one and to yourself. And so turning forward and saying, what can I learn from the past? If I'm going to look back, what do I want to do differently tomorrow? What do I want to take responsibility for to relieve guilt that I'm carrying? And how do I move towards the things that I want for my child in my own life? How do I model the validation of my own feelings of suffering instead of minimizing it because somebody else is in pain? And how do I proactively learn about areas that we didn't get the opportunity to learn about 50 years ago as frequently? Things like emotional validation, things like skill building around managing panic attacks, and being willing to model the level of courage and vulnerability it takes to admit limitations.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I think, again, our audience today and your audience and your clients are really blessed by your wisdom. And that was really moving. So thank you. And I do think that's a beautiful thing too, that we have to learn we have to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So we have to love our children as we love ourselves. It's a mystery, which means we have to then learn to do the sorts of things that getting lost in the agony is understandable, but it's not a good place to stay. And I think that's a real beautiful way of putting it. So you had shared with me when we were talking that the course that we had together on C.S. Lewis was something that's really helped you, and that you've returned to Lewis's thinking about the human person, about the Christian faith. Right, he has some books on. I love Till We Have Faces, a book really about kind of peeling off the mask that we have to adopt in order to survive a kind of a brutal society, and who are we really? He also has a book on the four loves, about like what's really going on with love of friend, romantic partner, or family, and how important and good these things are, and yet also how that on their own they can't sustain their own promises. They need somehow to be corrected by this divine love, at least in this fallen world. So what are some ideas? And of course, I love the whole Chronicles of Narnia story. I think it's just a beautiful story about hope and perseverance and trust in divine providence. But what would you say are just some of the things that you've gone back to, maybe as a youth minister or in your own reflections upon your own understanding of the faith and the human person?
Yes. Till We Have Faces is maybe the one I'll start with. I mean, that idea of having masks and it being peeled away, right? I think of defense mechanisms, the armor that we learn to use to survive. And so much of the work in therapy is gaining that awareness of, that's that mask, and here's what it's doing for me. Here's how it's helped me survive. It hasn't just been kind of helpful some days. It's been a thing I needed to survive. And God ultimately wants us to behold him face to face, right? And that process of taking down those layers and taking off the masks is incredibly painful. And it's painful in a different way than the suffering of not doing that work is. Oftentimes in therapy, people comment to me that, you should have a sign on your door that says, this is going to get worse, because it is qualitatively a different type of pain to heal. And I think of Till We Have Faces in that context. I think in that way, I love C.S. Lewis's ability to take fantasy and to communicate deep truths. In psychology, we do that when we interpret dreams. We kind of these random combinations, right, of themes and imagery that seem so nonsensical, time and time again can be illustrative. And in scripture, we see that their dreams can be a way God communicates to us. And so I think I often nod to C.S. Lewis when I think about just the magic that he discovered in communicating deep spiritual realities through analogy, through story, through fantasy. And he says, it's more real than anything. And I think that strikes me about therapy, about sitting with people, is I think it gave me a hunger for the really real, and the really real that's to be found in maybe unlikely places. And then I have to acknowledge a grief observed. That reflection in my own life, I have read that book probably 6 times at this point. I read that when my dad passed away in 2016, and I read that with my brother. We journaled through that book, and I continue to recommend it to people. And I love the humility of it, because he acknowledges it's a grief, right? It's his reflection, and yet in sharing his own vulnerable story of the journey of his loss of his wife, generations later, we're all still experiencing connection and community in our own processes of grief.
Well, we are at the end of our time, and I'd love to continue to talk. This has been so illuminating for me, and I hope for our audience as well. I think you've just kind of your own way of addressing and speaking in a way kind of almost incarnates the ability to seek a kind of, unified vision when we take our overall view of the human person and our vocation, right? Our being created by God and being called to live with God for eternity. And yet at the same time, not despising any of our humanity, not despising our emotions or the weirdness of our appetites or the weird ways in which our emotions collapse in upon themselves. So, right, we're not just anxious, we're anxious about being anxious. We're not just sad, we're sad about being sad, in the strange way that we can be so confusing to ourselves and frustrating, and that we can, and that healing is possible. I hope that listeners who are struggling or who love people are recognize that really the message is one of hope, not only hope for eternal life, although I do think sometimes that beautiful image of there was a woman on the show recently who had survived the Rwandan genocide, Immaculée Ilibagiza, and in part she said, life is short, eternity is very long. So it gives us hope, but also that there is hope in this world that we can get better at things. We can find better ways to deal with our anxieties and our depressions. And we're often, just like you were a tennis star. And, I used to go around in high school and never played, but just would occasionally hit the ball out of the court. And, most of us have we just never really learned how to play the game. And in some sense, we never really learned how to play the emotional game of life. Half the time, not even the moral game of life. And so, right, you're never too late. You're never too old to start. Today's a great day. And there's that line from C.S. Lewis with Prince Caspian that you may remember. But at one point, Lucy says, right, you mean I did the wrong thing? Would it have worked out if I'd followed you? And Aslan says to her, right, no one knows what would have happened, but anyone can find out what will happen, And then he breathes on her and says, right, courage, you are now a lioness, and now all Narnia will be renewed. And I think in a way, just that recovery of sense fantasy literature, but also that the work of therapy can help us to reintegrate. One way or another, we have to do that work, right? Whether or not it's with an actual therapist or not, or, whether or not it's simply just to grow as a human being. And anyway, you've just presented such a beautiful vision. So for people who are interested, we did talk a couple of your books that you've written, Julia Sadusky, Talking to Your Kids About Sex, Talking with Your Teen About Sex, a practical guide for Catholics that's with Ave Maria Press. With Brazos Press, there's Emerging Gender Identities, Understanding the Diverse Experience of Today's Youth, co-authored with Mark Yarhouse. You have a website, and it's juliasadusky.com?
That's right, juliasadusky.com, and people can follow along on Instagram, and that's where I usually post upcoming speaking engagements as well.
Okay. And people could invite you to come and speak at a parish
yes,
or at some other event?
Yes, absolutely. I travel about once a month for that.
Do you do online counseling?
I can in most states. I have, it's called PsyPact, and it allows me to see people in not every state, but most states. So people can always reach out. Okay.
Well, again, thank you so much. And again, for listeners, Julia Sadusky was an Ave graduate. I think you graduated, in 2013? 13? Mm-hmm. Wow. So what a wonderful 11 years to now be already established in the field, and a wonderful gift to so many people. So thank you for being on the show, Julia.
Yes, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.